method for dealing with performance is really about enabling winners, and it's based on our understanding that growth is really about empowering people. And you've heard the rule of thumb that says if you want to empower somebody to fish, then don't give them a fish. I mean, the first thing you have to do is you've got to give them some stuff, a hook, a line, a sinker, a bait, a boat, and so on. And then you've got to teach the person to use that stuff. You've got to teach them how to bait a hook and where they should cast and why they should fish. And if one wanted to ask oneself, well, what's the difference between these two categories? Then clearly the first category is about stuff. And so we call that category means. These are all things that, in a sense, sit outside of the person. The second category looks at the person's skill or competence, and you can therefore call that category ability. But the point is that if you only do those two things, then you haven't fully empowered the person. Because if you said to the person at this point, don't worry, I've got a freezer full of fish. If you don't catch a fish after this, I'll give you one from my freezer. Then the person may still not be willing to fish. So the question is, what else do you need to add to the party here? And that is, in a sense, a kind of bloody mindedness, which says, if you don't catch a fish after this, starve. And that, in a sense, is about accountability. So our point here is that empowerment means three things. It means to give a person the means to do what's required of them, to make them able to do what's required of them, and to hold them accountable. And if you don't do all three of those things, you don't empower somebody, you disable them. And if you want to ask yourself, well, what does this mean in the context of an organization? Then consistent with an idea of means would be to give somebody the tools that they need to do the job, the resources they need, the authority they need, the information they need, a clear standard, your time as the boss. And if you wanted to make the person able, you really have to teach them how to do what's required of them and why they should do it. And if you look at this issue of accountability is really about consistent rewards and punishments. And it therefore makes sense that running through the middle of the issue of accountability is the issue of standards. You can't hold somebody accountable for anything if there isn't a clear standard for what's required of them, which suggests somebody's performance is either going to be above standard or it'll be below standard. Somebody's performance can be above standard in one of two ways. They're either going the extra mile or they're careful to do what's required of them. Somebody's performance can be below standard in one of two ways. The person is either deliberately malevolent, in other words, they're deliberately doing what is unacceptable, or the person is just careless. And if the person's gone the extra mile, then the appropriate thing to do with that person is to reward the person. If the person is careful, the appropriate thing to do is to recognize that person. If the person is deliberately malevolent, the appropriate thing to do is to dismiss that person or to punish them. If the person is careless, then the appropriate thing to do is to censure or to warn them. Now, if one looks at this instrument from this point of view, it becomes apparent that there's a logical order to this. In a sense, you can't hold somebody accountable if you've not given them the means or the ability to do what's required of them, which suggests that there's a dividing line that operates over here, which means that these two variables of means and ability are really a precondition for holding somebody accountable. And that means that in the process of empowering somebody, you can make one of two mistakes. You can make what we would call a hard mistake or a soft mistake. And the hard mistake is to treat means and ability issues as if they are accountability issues. So, for example, you've got somebody working for you. You've not given them the person the tools to do what's required of them or the resources that they may need, or you've not made the person able. You've not taught them how to do what's required of them or why they should do it. And therefore, no surprise, the person's performance is below standard. And if you at this point either censure or punish the person, then what you're doing is fundamentally unfair. The soft mistake, in a sense, is the opposite. It's to treat accountability issues as if they are means and ability issues. So, for example, the person has all the tools and resources required of them, all the means. They're perfectly able to do what's required of them. Their performance is below standard, and you go and coach them or you go and send them on a course, rather than either censuring or dismissing the person. That's what we would understand as the soft mistake. Now, of the two, the soft mistake is infinitely worse than the hard mistake, because the soft mistake is the equivalent of leaving the rotten apple in the barrel. I mean, if you don't hold people accountable who are stepping over the line, in a sense, it gives everybody else in the organization license to misbehave. It also produces an incremental growth of control. If I'm not going to hold the person who stepped over the line accountable, then the only other alternative I have is to impose a control to make sure that nobody does the same thing ever again. So a person in the organization abuses a company credit card, and we send the person on a corporate governance course, but we take all the credit cards away from everybody else in the company. And that's the effect of the soft mistake. The soft mistake, in a sense, makes everybody else guilty of the crime of those who step over the line. So this really suggests that there's a standard for dealing with performance. So should a leader encounter an employee who's gone the extra mile, it's clear that the leader should praise that person or reward that person in a recognizable and public way. And should a leader encounter a person who's performed to standard, the leader should thank the employee. Should the subordinate not be acting to standard, the first thing that the leader should therefore do is to ask, was this a means issue, an ability issue, or an accountability issue? And if it was a means issue, then really one of these things would be at issue. Either was the person aware of the standard? Was the standard clear? Did the person have the tools to comply to the standard? Did the person have the resources to comply to the standard? Did the person have the information to comply to the standard? Did the person have the authority to comply to the standard? And if these variables are at issue, then the leader should address these issues. An ability issue at issue, then basically the only two questions the leader would need to answer is that, does the person know why they should do what's required of them? And do they know how to do what's required of them? And then finally, we have the issue of accountability. The leader should ask, should the person be proved to be careless or negligent? Then the leader should warn this person. And that warning could be anything from a verbal caution to a final written warning or ultimately a dismissal. If the person is proved to be deliberately not complying to the standard, the person should be dismissed. Now, this suggests a standard for dealing with performance. And as you can see, that there's a logical role of the standard where the leader starts off by asking, did the person go the extra mile? And then the leader asks if the person has performed to standard, and then only does the leader think in terms of non-compliance to standard. And even so, if this is the case, the first thing the leader asks is, was this a means issue? The second thing the leader asks is, was this an ability issue? And then finally, the leader asks, is this an accountability issue? And so it means that the leader sets out with the intent to find people doing the right things or going the extra mile. And should he find that the person's performance is not to standard, the leader will first consider whether this is a means issue. Then the leader would consider if it's an ability issue. And then the leader would finally consider if it's an accountability issue. So it's clear that the intent of the standard is not punitive. I mean, you're not trying to find reasons to hold people accountable. It is really to empower people. What we have here is a process whereby a leader can operationalize the standard for dealing with performance. And it's literally a check in the box process. So it starts off with the leader asking the question, did this person go the extra mile? And if the answer to that is no, then the leader would tick no. Did that person do what was required of them to standard? And if the answer to that is no, they would check no. Was the person below standard because the standard wasn't clear? Let's assume that the answer to that is no. Then they would go further down. Was the person's performance below standard because they didn't have the tools? Let's assume that the answer to that is yes. So the tick to that is yes. You would then stop there because it means that you've worked through the process and you found out what the key thing is that you should be providing this particular subordinate now. And the leader would then indicate the specific action to be taken, the specific tool that needs to be provided. Let's assume it's a particular tool to calibrate instrumentation on a production line. Then that's what the boss would say, would indicate in the specific action taken. So the aim of this process is literally to provide a clean piece of process that delivers a specific outcome with regard to how a leader should deal with a particular performance-related issue that follows the leadership standard for dealing with performance.